Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 236 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danièle Cybulskie, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. We live in a world full of distractions. Constant notifications, interruptions, and complications make it hard to sustain any sort of deep thought, even when we have the very best of intentions. If only we could get away from it all like medieval monks did, the peace and quiet of solitude would allow us to concentrate. Or would it? As it turns out, one of the things medieval monks complained about most was just how hard it is to focus. Peace and quiet and a life built almost solely around contemplation, and still the human brain refused to come to heel. So how did medieval monks deal with the monkey mind? If you love monks, want some new old strategies for concentration, or just want to feel seen in your struggle with meditation, this is the episode for you. This week, I spoke with Dr. Jamie Kreiner about one of the world's great writers on distraction, John Cassian. Jamie is professor of history at the University of Georgia and the author of The Wandering Mind, What Medieval Monks Tell Us About Distraction. You may remember her from a few years ago when we spoke about pigs in honor of her wonderful book, Legions of Pigs in the Early Medieval West. Her new book is called How to Focus, a monastic guide for an age of distraction, and I chose it as one of the best medieval books I read last year. Our conversation on John Cassian's best tips for busy minds is coming up right after this. Well, thank you, Jamie, for coming on to talk about Cassian. I'm so happy to have you back on the podcast. Welcome back.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right, so your book is all about one particular monk called John Cassian, and he's writing in late antiquity. Can you tell us who he was and when we're talking about?
John Cassian was a monk who lived in the later Roman Empire in the later 4th and early 5th centuries. So he was born in the 360s, and he was part of a group, a generation of Christians who were seeking out monastic pioneers, I guess you could call them, who lived in Egypt and the Levant. These sort of early ascetics were at that point old enough to be their parents and their grandparents, and Cassian and others went on pilgrimages, long pilgrimages, to seek them out and learn from them personally. And in this account that he wrote of a series of conversations with these monastic elders, the collationes, he did all of this traveling with his best friend, Germanus. So this book is structured as a dialogue with a sequence of different mentors that they seek out to consult.
Yeah, and it's actually a huge bunch of writing that he does, and you've compiled it down, right? Just so we know, it is a compilation that you have condensed even further so that it makes more sense, right? Why did you condense it?
Yeah, so it's part of the series for Princeton University Press called Ancient Wisdom for Modern Readers. And they're slim books. They're very readable translations, but they're also on the short side. So, Cassian's original Collationes is huge. It's a doorstop. And I thought it would be fun to just select the things in his text that were most directly concerned with a problem that Cassian was kind of obsessed with, which is, what is the mind doing when it misbehaves? How do you make it behave better? I mean, that's an issue that runs throughout the book, but I pulled out the sections that had sort of the most direct advice or were most directly resonant today. And I guess to some, it might seem like that's sort of disingenuous cut and pasting, but actually that was really popular in late antiquity and the Middle Ages to take out the things that you wanted and compile them into a new version for your own uses.
Yeah, Cassian wouldn't have even blinked at that. He'd be like, of course, this is what you're doing. Of course, that's his work. So he probably was like, no, you should read the whole thing. But yeah, this is a very common way of putting things together. And of course, when you're talking about distraction, it's good to have a small work to start with.
Yes.
So when we're talking about these desert hermits, beginnings of monasticism, how are they hearing about these figures that they want to go and interview? Like, how do they know that they're out there and where to find them?
Definitely stories are circulating word of mouth. People make pilgrimages and go back home and talk about it. Also, there's a lot of kind of travel literature that circulates really early on. Monks get a lot written about them pretty quickly. And that creates a kind of fan readership for these stories, so that even if, most people didn't end up upending their lives to go, to go see the monks personally, but loved reading about them. And so, yeah, in a way, Cassian's own book becomes another set of stories that circulate around the Mediterranean.
And he doesn't stay in one place. So we're talking about the desert monks at first. Those are the first people that he visits. But where does he go? Because he's collecting this information from everywhere, right?
He starts off in the Levant in a monastery with Germanus, but then they basically develop this idea that that's where the sort of less rigorous or less serious monks are. And so they make their way to Egypt. And the stories center on the mentors that they interview in the Nile Delta primarily, but also some further afield. And this is Cassian's opinion that the Egyptians were sort of the best at being monks, but it's definitely an opinion that circulated a lot because Cassian's work was so popular. Eventually, he goes on, he briefly is in Constantinople, then he goes to Rome, he ends up in Gaul, and it's actually in Gaul where he ends up writing the Collationes finally after all of that traveling.
That would be hard to do, remembering all of that, remembering the different people who are giving him different advice over the many years that he's doing this. Because I think in the book you say when he ends up in Gaul, he's in his 50s. So this has been a long road and a lot to remember.
Yeah, I mean, I think in part, yeah, it's important to keep in mind these are not transcriptions of interviews he was having. I mean, in part, these elders that he spoke with, most of them were speaking Coptic, so they needed a translator. He and Germanus were probably speaking in Greek. And then Cassian writes the Collationes in Latin, so there's like already all these degrees of translation or difference. But I also think Cassian's memory and most people's memories were better trained than ours are now. So I think there probably also is a lot that he's capturing pretty deeply. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely a strategic kind of representation. It's not like this is exactly what happened 20 years ago.
And it's not what people would expect from this kind of writing anyway. They're expecting it to be shaped, right?
Yeah, I mean, Cassian was a member of a highly educated elite group, and he's writing for highly educated people, and they study their rhetoric well and expect texts to be crafted with particular goals and arguments in mind. And his definitely is that.
Yeah, this dialogue thing is super familiar to anybody who's reading it at the time. And you really thought hard about how you wanted to translate this. Can you tell us a little bit about your thought process? Because you have put this into a stylized sort of modern English. Tell us what you were thinking when you were coming at this translation for your own work.
Well, in some ways, the decision I had to make was like all translators have to make, which is how much do you want to make it accessible and readable in a language everyone is using currently? And how much do you want to actually create a sense of distance or unfamiliarity or difference because these people are not 21st century Americans? And how can the translation in some way remind you that these people aren't identical to your perspective, to your culture, to your identity? At the same time, I think Cassian also was a little bit of a challenge because he used some terms that became cognates in later Christian theology and even in modern usage for dogmatic concepts that when Cassian was using these words at the time didn't have the same valence. So, for example, his word vitium comes to mean vice. And we think of, these standard vices in Catholic theology. But when Cassian's writing, he means vitium like you've got a kind of inherent weakness or defect or deficiency. It's like something innate in you that's not functioning properly. There was no sort of technical religious term that he meant by it, even though his text is, of course, deeply Christian. So his psychology is full of these terms that he's using almost experimentally or in an exploratory way, and to kind of put labels on them that are most familiar to us kind of flattens out that real intelligent way he's trying to make sense of a complex topic.
Well, it is very hard to describe a state of mind in general. And I think that's probably one of the reasons why he has different ancient wise people telling him about this, how to keep from being distracted, because it's hard to describe. And sometimes you need to hear it in a different way.
That's totally one of the overarching themes and structuring principles of this book. It's like everyone needs different advice at different times. Even the same person can change depending on what day it is or how old you are or whatever. So in monastic practice in general, there's no one single punchline or fix or solution. You've got to kind of keep shifting in this almost kaleidoscopic way what the guidance might be, because you're complicated, life is complicated, the mind is complicated. So this is why he proliferates with his mentors, and also even the way he presents himself in Germanus over the course of the text changes. They start off more novice, they become expert, but then they realize by the end they're not that smart, they still need guidance. It's really sensitive to that dynamic.
I think you find that in a lot of monastic writing where people are like, you're going to be an expert and you're still going to have the same problems as a novice. So just get ready for that up front. So
yes.
What is the problem? What is the problem? What do Cassian and Germanus have a problem with?
Well, at root, the reason they're going from monk to monk is they want to improve their monastic practice, and a kind of conflict that they find themselves in, like many monks found themselves in late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, was you sacrifice a ton of things for this profession, for this new way of life. You give up your connections to your family and friends and social network in order to dedicate yourself, ideally single-mindedly, to concentrating on God. And after doing that really wrenching work, they found that they still had a hard time actually focusing single-mindedly on the divine and on their ethical obligations within this divine system. So, they had these very searching conversations about how they could improve that concentration, how their dedication could deepen, how they could really learn to watch themselves and know themselves better and really scrutinize what's happening internally so that the mind can stretch out further and hold on tighter to what it was actually searching for. And so throughout all of the books of the Collationes, this is a question they keep coming back to. Even though it's not the only one, it's definitely one of the most pervasive, this problem of cognition.
And I know that this is part of the series because this is a perennial problem, especially if you've ever tried to meditate. The first few times it's so frustrating because you're like, I can't stop thinking about other things. And any ancient wisdom to do with this is that's normal, right? Is this what the monks are saying as well? That's normal.
Yeah, that there's actually something innate about the human condition that makes the mind move. And so in part, once you've accepted this as just something that happens, how do you strengthen your mind? How do you train it? It's not like it has tendencies, but you can work with those tendencies to try to redirect its energy. And so I think that's sort of another recurring piece of guidance you find, not just in Cassian, but in a lot of monastic literature, is this kind of empathy toward even the experts are going to keep struggling with this. It's not something you eventually fix if you're really good.
Yeah. And they also say, near the end of the book, I think it might be Abraham that says this, you have to renounce everything that you love and you have to renounce it every day. You're going to have to keep renouncing it because you're going to be tempted to go back to things that are comfortable.
Yeah, we sort of focus on this initial flashy moment when you give everything up the first time, but really, it's a perpetual process. And for Cassian, this is maybe his most pervasive recurring point is monasticism isn't a one-off decision. It's a perpetual practice that requires constant upkeep and maintenance and commitment.
Yeah. And what's interesting, I think, about Cassian and Germanus is that the way that they ask their questions, it's like they're looking for a magic bullet. Like, what is the one thing that we can do that's going to fix it, right? Help us fix it just once and for all. And they're always disappointed.
I love the way that he frames their perspective with the sort of wise elder as a contrast. They're always so, again, this position of empathy, they're so relatable. It's like they've been monks for a really long time, but they keep coming and thinking, I'm so eager, I have this idea, and they're always let down a little bit, or they're confused, or they have to be reminded repeatedly about something. It's really, it's a really smart move on his part to present themselves that way.
Yeah. And one of my favorite moments, it's near the end of the book. So they have been monks for quite a long time. And they say, we just want to go home. We think it would be better if we just go home where it's familiar and we won't get interrupted. People can make our meals. I think we should go home. And that I think is so relatable as well. There's got to be a moment in every monk's life where they're like, I could probably do this better. at home or I'm not homesick all the time.
I know it was so smart to put that as the rhetorical move, where it's not like I'm giving up. It's more like, oh, you know what? I think I'm such a good monk now that actually I would be better at home because then my parents could just take care of all my food and lodging concerns and I could just think about this all the time. They really, yeah. And then to be totally shut down, uh, where the elder is like, oh my God, I feel like you haven't learned anything if you think that's the solution.
Yeah, he's like, really? Let's think about this for a second.
And that's a big part of Cassian makes that move because monks who were really good at being monks were always really concerned about being proud and that their sort of self-assurance or confidence in their mastery of the discipline would lead them actually to this counterproductive state of not trying anymore. And so I think this is why he puts it at the end. It's like, yeah, you've progressed to this pretty advanced level, but look, you're just as susceptible to thinking you've got it all figured out and that actually you could coast from here on out. It's a way of like practicing humility by presenting themselves as this kind of clueless pair, even at the end.
Yeah, I love it. I love it because they are so relatable. And I think it's in the same section, it might be a different section, but where the elder is saying there are some monks that spend a lot of time outdoors and they're farming and all of that. And that's great. But if you put them in a cell by themselves, they'll go nuts. And that means that they still have work to do.
Yeah, there's something just so, I think, counterintuitive almost of, we imagine ancient monks who have figured out what meditation looks like and they're sitting in their cell and they're just in this state where they're totally locked in. And I love those moments in Cassian and other monastic writings where it's like, nope, actually, you're sitting alone in your cell. Things go downhill pretty rapidly often, actually.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of meditation, something that people in the modern world who are more familiar with Eastern forms of meditation might be familiar with is that there's at least one elder that says, I use a mantra, and it is a line from scripture, but he's like, I repeat this all the time and it helps me. Why don't you try that? And we should get into what it is or what the crux of it is. Well, my favorite part is he's like, it works for every condition. And the first like 4 examples he gives are about food.
Oh, yeah. For Cassian and a lot of his contemporaries, food was like the most critical test or challenge because every single day you were reminded by your body that it needed things that your mind wasn't necessarily interested in being concerned about. And you weren't going to fully master it. Like you couldn't stop eating, you would die. Was there a way that your mind could show some control so that at least when you started getting a little hungry, you could still finish the thing you were trying to finish? I mean, even if you're trying to be moderate in terms of the way that you handled your diet and your fasting, that's still a big challenge. And so, yeah, of course, it's going to be these issues of food that first come up when the mantra comes in handy.
So what is this mantra about? What is the mantra? Basically, is what I'm trying to ask.
The mantra is a psalm. It's just one line, "Oh God, come to my assistance. Oh Lord, make haste to help me." And the advice that Isaac gives them in handing them this mantra is to say, you should be reciting this all the time, in part because it contains within the text itself a reminder of what you're supposed to be doing, which is you're basically completely at the mercy of God. You just need to choose to reach out to him to tell him you need help. So it's got this core message embedded within it that you can pay attention to, but also just by virtue of reciting it perpetually, it pulls your mind and your body back to your core task, which is to be thinking about God. And Isaac is like, say it all the time. Say it when you're going to the bathroom, when you're eating, right before you go to bed, when you wake up. Ideally, it'll start happening in your sleep too. Just say it all the time. And he offered this as a kind of counter advice to something other monks preferred to do, which is a more kind of exploratory meditational style where instead of reciting a single verse, you're thinking about a passage of text or scripture, and then you use kind of associative memories to say, this text makes me think about this other passage, and comparing those two makes me see this idea in a new way, which reminds me of this other thing I read. So you're kind of stitching together this bigger set of related ideas to really analyze this text and come to a deeper, richer understanding of it. But to Cassian and the other monks, that was kind of a dangerous game because meditation could start to look like wandering a little too much, or it was easy to leave yourself open to distraction because you were moving around so much. So this mantra was kind of a different way of using and thinking about scripture. But it's funny. I mean, my favorite part about the discussion of the mantra is that at the end, again, Germanus and Cassian are like, okay, great. We have this mantra. How do we keep it in our heads all the time? And Isaac is like, I feel like I already told you all of that. It's a very circular problem.
It's true. And what I liked about this mantra as well is when it was first mentioned, I'm like, well, I don't know. Like, should you be asking God for help all the time? Like, isn't that just pestering him? And then he gives all the examples about like when you're hungry or when you get food and it's not the food you want to, gives you all of the examples about food. But then he also says that it's for the moments when you don't necessarily need as much help, like rescuing from temptation. But when you get into that perfect state of prayer, it's hard to stay there. And anyone who's meditated knows this. It's hard to stay there. And then you ask God for help to keep you in that state of bliss. And so it's really fascinating watching all the different ways he applies this single mantra. And it just really sounds like he's cracked it for himself. Like he spent all this time as a monk, Isaac, and he's like, this is it. This is my secret sauce right here.
Yeah, I mean, I think in some way, it's not just like trying to have a different set of skills that serve you at different times. I think it is also a way of demonstrating different things work for different people. I totally agree. It's like these conversations remind me a little of the way that writers exchange personal routine stories about like how they keep a writing practice going.
Yeah.
Or like share stories about famous philosophers who wrote every day, like from 4 to 6, and I went for a long walk or whatever. In a way, it's sort of like, okay, what really worked for you? Maybe I can get some of that.
That's exactly it. And I think that's what makes the book so relatable. And another thing that they mention that Cassian and Germanus mention is, I think Cassian specifically says, I'm always thinking about stories from when I was a kid. And to me, it reminds me of us these days. We might be having a moment of quiet, or it's supposed to be a serious moment, like maybe you're in church or in a meeting or something, and like a little jingle from back in the day comes into your head and you can't get it out. And I thought that was so relatable as well. I think he says he's supposed to be praying, and then in front of his eyes or in front of his mind, heroes start to fight. And I think the advice is you got to block that out by reading as many years of scripture, something like that, right?
Yeah, I really connected with that story too. I mean, we're so used to like having songs come into our head, things remembered when we were a kid. And I think what I like about that story is it's shared as a kind of consolation. Like, of course, you're going to remember all that war poetry you memorized when you were in elementary school. It's because yeah, you were doing it for years and you were really excited by it. You need to put in the same amount of time, build some new memories, then new stuff will come to you, rather than just hoping in this empty way that you'll just forget stuff. They're like, nope, you got to edge it out by stocking your memory with even more to pull out.
It sounds like a simple solution, but I can imagine this is something that Cassian worked on and was like, oh man, this is why I need more advice. This is why I need a mantra, because I keep getting these war stories in my head.
Yeah, I mean, also given that so much of ancient literature came in the form of metered poetry, which, not only are these really vivid narratives, but there's also this like sonic and rhythmic quality to it that makes it all the more catchy. It is really a challenge. I mean, it meant you had to become pretty skilled in developing counter memories that had as many hooks basically that you could really like store and see and access later. So again, since they come from this really educated world, they know how much power there is in that old poetry.
Yeah, it is so distracting to have this old stuff in your mind. And again, this is why there are so many different bits of advice in the book. And another one that is mentioned is having short-term goals and having long-term goals. So can you tell us about that discussion?
So this is the first piece of advice that Cassian and Germanus get in the book. And yeah, it's basically like before you even sort of start off and get to work, you need to know what it is you're trying to aim for. Because otherwise, You won't be able to measure your progress. You won't know if you got anywhere because you don't know where you were going. And it's also really hard to make decisions about what to do if you haven't decided what it is that you want in the end. So they compare it to, if you're a blacksmith, you know what it is you need to make. You don't just start hammering for no reason. Or if you're an archer, you're aiming at a target, right? Otherwise, you don't know if your shot is good or not. So the long-term goal, they decide for all monks, is the kingdom of heaven, not just sort of getting to paradise after you die, but also reaching a state in the present where your mind is firmly fixed on God, on the divine order. The short-term goal is something that they call clarity of heart. It's the means to the end. It's the thing that you need to be striving for day to day, because that's the thing that's going to get you to the finish line. And so for them, clarity of heart is a kind of unperturbed state in which we might just think of it as intense, genuine concentration. So all these other tips that are offered in the course of the book, they're aiming for this clarity of heart, knowing that clarity of heart will eventually point you in this right direction. But it's the sort of compass for the rest of the book.
Yeah, it's that beginner part of it. And I think it's funny if you read other books about business or motivation or anything like that, it's the same type of thing where they're like, you need to have a SMART goal. Where are you going? And so it's so familiar to see this happening, like ancient SMART goals to start with before you even take that journey.
Well, I realized in working on Monks and Distraction, one of the things they have the benefit of is knowing what it is they want. I think a lot of us feel kind of overwhelmed and distracted now, but it's also hard to be like, okay, well, what is it that I actually want to pay attention to? Cassian knows he wants to be reading scripture. He wants to be focusing on divine ethics. He's aiming for the kingdom of heaven. That's already like, that's a lot of work that he's doing for himself and for these other monks and establishing that, because then once those decisions are made, it's not easy to discipline yourself, but it's easier to do it because you know where you want to go.
Yeah, it's true. That is a big difference between them and us. They have a sort of North Star that they're heading towards. And I think at the end, the analogy is that you can't build a dome without understanding where the center is. And so even at the end of the book, it comes back around to the fact that you need to know where you're going or you're just never going to get there.
Yeah. It's so fun, I think, how Cassian draws on so many different metaphors to try to drive home how important these barometers, or I mean, it's hard not to use metaphors ourselves, measuring sticks, goals, targets in this contemplative process.
Yeah. And as you say, they compare themselves to different professions or even athletes. And when I was looking at this, one of the things I was thinking of, and when I was writing about monks as well, is that like athletes, they have to have not just the right temperament, but a real tolerance for boredom. And what I love about the way that monks write, and it's in this book as well, is they tell you right out, it's boring. And you have to have a high tolerance for boredom. And that's how you get to be elite.
Yeah. The monk John Climacus, who was writing probably in the 7th century, was like, if monks knew how hard it was when they first started, they wouldn't do it. So you've got to kind of ease people into this knowledge of how taxing it is.
Yeah. And I mean, this is one of the reasons why I think that Saint Benedict was saying nobody should grumble, because I think it would fall down like a house of cards if everybody started talking about this is really awful, we should go home. Then the whole thing just falls apart. So I think that has a lot to do with why monks are meant to be silent, or at least not grumble a lot. And it's interesting to know that Cassian was one of the people that was recommended by Benedict, someone that they should listen to, someone that they should read. In part, I would guess because it's something that they can empathize with. Do you think that's true?
Yeah, I mean, they saw his work as, even though he wasn't like a hagiographer, he does embody a lot of advice. He focalizes it through the interactions of people and their own experiences. And that, instead of like a treatise or more abstract philosophical exploration, really helps people see it as a problem represented in something human. I also think he probably would have really appreciated Benedict's attention to sound and speaking, both not saying things and grumbling, because chit chat, monks believed, was a really, we tend to think of distraction as like a visual thing, like oh, another text popped up, or I have too many tabs open. I mean, especially with screens, it's very visually oriented, but monks thought distraction came primarily in the form of auditory distraction. So if someone's saying something, you can't like preemptively close your ears. You just hear it without deciding if you were going to hear it or not. And especially if you're living in a community, hearing fellow monks gripe about something, yeah, not only are you going to get distracted just listening to the conversation, but I mean, the power of collective sentiment is so strong. You could start feeling discouraged really rapidly if everybody was sort of grumpy about something or unhappy about something.
Yeah. And that's why you need to have that target. Keep coming back to the target because you're going to get distracted and discouraged. You see that in all sorts of monastic writing, and it's here as well. And one of the things they mention, and when I was first looking at monks, I mean, I started to work on that book because I didn't know a lot about monks and I wanted to learn more about them. And the thing that surprised me most was how often monks are told to take a break. And you see this at the end. So can you tell us a little bit about the way that people are thinking about taking a break when it comes to concentrating on spiritual things?
Yeah, monks were at risk of basically being overzealous and a little too hardcore. I mean, they were just so serious and so enthusiastic that they could overdo it. And that was a problem in part because it created a kind of competitive climate. They also worried that they'd be doing it to be showy rather than doing it because they authentically were committed to the work. But most basically, you could exhaust yourself out. You could harm your body so much that it actually impaired your mind's ability to stay focused and do the work it needed to do. You could also just wear out your brain from overwork. So Cassian has this story near the very end of the Collationes where he talks about an elder who's just sitting around petting a game bird, and this non-Christian philosopher comes by in like full hunting gear and is like, what are you doing? You know, just sitting around. I heard all these great things about you. I am not so impressed right now. The monk was like, you've got to take a break sometimes. Just like your hunting bow can't be taut all the time. It'd get too loose. You need to relax. I'm sitting here with my partridge. This is necessary. And again, this is a sort of way of showing like even the experts get tired and you need some time. It was also a way of undercutting this cool philosopher and his hunting gear, because monks were kind of making this case that if you're a philosopher, you shouldn't be involved in this elite masculine military sport anyway.
I don't think it's a coincidence that it's a partridge that he's petting as the hunter comes up.
Exactly. Yeah.
One of the things that's distracting and that is reframed by one of the elders into being a good thing is that other monks keep coming by for a chat about spiritual matters. And Cassian's like, or I think it's Germanus is like, I'm trying to concentrate and these monks keep coming by. This is one of the reasons I said I should go home, because then there wouldn't be monks coming by all the time. And it's reframed as a good thing. Do you remember how it's reframed in the book?
Well, I mean, this is something that monks struggled with a lot. It's like you have these two competing sets of norms and they're both good things. And how do you prioritize one or the other? So sometimes it's like you have non-monks coming to visit you for advice and support. You owe them a sort of hospitable welcome. On the other side of things, you've also decided you wanted to dedicate yourself to contemplation, to prayer. Which one do you choose? And in this case, in this variation of the story, it's, yeah, fellow monks coming to seek advice. And it's in part, this is another example of it's okay to take a break. And in part, it's framed as, you know, this is beneficial for them, for the community. In part, these monks benefit from you, but on the flip side, you benefit from them. It reminds me of another thing Climacus said, which is you don't really know how fast you're going or how far you're going unless you're running with other horses. It's sort of a similar thing. You could have this idea of yourself as being so good at being a monk until these people show up and you're like, oh, they're all pretty good. I guess I'm not such a standout figure here. So community is really a key part of monasticism. And it just reminds you that your top priority can't always be your top priority. You have to have some flexibility there, which is another lesson people need to hear over and over again, because it's easier to just have one rule and one rule only, but that's not realistic.
Yeah, he's saying you should be thankful for this because, and this is another kind of acknowledgement about human nature, is that people need other people, and you might not like it, but humans need other people around. So You have to be okay with other people visiting. And like you say, it's a good relaxation. It's a good way to talk to people. And then there's a snide comment, which I also appreciate. It's like, it's going to make you appreciate solitude that much more.
Yeah. Yeah. It's sort of a variation on this theme of like monks liked to meditate on death because not only did it have your end goal in mind, again, like reminding you of what your long-term goal was, but it also did make put the present in perspective. So yeah, they love to sort of toggle with like, imagine yourself in this case. Does your present situation seem different now?
Yeah. And I think that's super relatable as well. So I read this book early on last summer, and then I just read it again before I spoke to you. And of course, like we've been saying all along, different parts were speaking to me at different times. And so I think this is a book I'm going to come back to again. And even though it's very much a Christian perspective and that I'm not a practicing Christian by any means, it's so good to have this relatable voice or relatable voices from back in the day. So when you were translating this, were there parts that spoke to you or bits of advice that you took from it that you're like, I'm going to come back to this when I'm feeling like I'm fasting too much? Just kidding. Like when things are too much or you're too distracted, are there things that you've come back to since putting this book together?
I mean, in general, I think looking at professionals, finding that the work of the mind is difficult is just always a consolation. If we feel like we're distracted and haven't been able to focus, that's not a problem that a single person can solve. That's a long-term historical issue. I also think I've always really loved the story we talked about earlier where Cassian and Germanus are like, we're going to go home. We figured it out. We'll let someone else take care of stuff for us. Because I think the fantasy that things are going to be better in some remote location or some location where all of our needs are taken care of, that's not just a grass is greener situation. That's actually like the work is required. You don't just sort of get to buy out of it and then suddenly you're fixed or solved. The challenge of being human in part is something worth concentrating on. And then I also, yeah, I mean, the mantra one I think about all the time, like if I'm not Christian either, but it's like if I had like a one verse thing that I kept saying over and over to kind of pull my mind back to calm or to get myself out of a difficult crisis, like what would that be? And I don't have an answer for that. I think in some ways I'm a little envious of Cassian for getting this advice from Isaac, because what would it mean to like believe in a piece of text so deeply that really could be a lifeline for you?
Yeah, that it would be unchanging for every situation. And that's why it's so beautiful when it's presented. Like you can use this for anything. Cause yeah, I've thought about that as well. Like if you're going to pick a mantra, what is it going to be? And it's going to be different on the day or, you know, in that life situation, a different year. And so it is something to envy almost, which is totally counter to what Cassian would want. You know, having a one size fits all mantra. And that it's interesting to think about how he came to that and why he picked it and how it really speaks to Isaac's human frailty that he's like, I got this, it'll work.
Yeah. I mean, I think even a lot of monks in the end found that they needed a lot more than just one phrase. I mean, there was this collection of texts that were popular at the same time the Collationes were, called the Sayings of the Desert Elders, or the Apophthegmata Patrum. And some of them are short little stories, and some of them are basically like one-line pieces of advice. And monks shared these and circulated them and riffed on them for centuries. And it's very much like our own penchant for collecting quotations or notable sayings. We tend to write them down now. Sometimes we have a few in mind. Or also our way of like quoting, honestly, like song lyrics or TV lines, you know, they kind of take on richness as you apply them in different contexts. Sometimes it's even funny. So really maybe what's more realistic, even in the late antique monastic context, is not one single mantra, but the sort of battery of different quotations that kind of helps you, you know, you apply one to one situation and one to another.
And you can pull them out when you start to think about old advertising from back in the day. Well, I'm hoping that people will read your book widely and start to pull out things there that might be useful for them, because as the whole reason behind the book suggests, that we are still having the same problems with distraction. And I'm really hoping that people will come to your book, even though it's a series they may not have seen or touched before. I'm hoping people will seek out your book and use it as another tool in the toolkit to just be more okay with themselves and the human problem of distraction. So thanks so much for coming on, Jamie, and talking to us about Cassian's work.
Yeah, this was a lot of fun. Thanks so much.
To find out more about Jamie's work, you can visit her faculty page at the University of Georgia. Her new book is How to Focus, a monastic guide for an age of distraction. Before we go, here's Peter from Medievalistsnet to tell us what's on the website. What's up, Peter?
Hey, well, I have this kind of love of learning about the medieval world and how interconnected it is.
Mm-hmm.
I always will try to find ways to upend the notion that like medieval communities were separate and isolated from each other. So I have this piece about Albanians in medieval London. So the highlight comes from 1386 when two Venetian ships stop by in London. And there's a workers' revolt among the crew, which is mostly Albanians. And they pick from one of themselves a leader, name him their king, and then have a march through London.
Wow.
To confront the ship bosses and kind of humiliate them a bit. So that must have been a fun day in London. But the article kind of goes on, talks about how Albanians were there as crew members, that they would stay at London or Southampton for sometimes just days, but sometimes for months at a time. And some even were involved as traders there. I love that kind of little connections in the medieval world.
Yeah, because obviously that's going to be something that changes people's day-to-day life, right? I love that stuff.
That's right. So we have news about that, plus about a new series from Oxford University Press. It's called the Xu Library of Classical Chinese Literature. So if you're like a fan of, say, Dunbar and Oakes texts, medieval texts, or the Penguin Classics, this is another thing for you. So it gives you text and translations of this kind of Chinese medieval lit.
Oh, that is awesome. That is so good. And such a long time coming, having Chinese literature available in English with the translation. That's amazing.
Yeah. So there's like 4 books put out first, and one of them is called The Misadventures of Master Mugwort. So it is a joke book written at different stages during the medieval period in China. And it's pretty funny.
I love it.
So we have that. Plus, we have more from Steve Tibble about Crusader strategy and a look at a new exhibition that just actually started yesterday at the Louvre.
Perfect. Okay, well, there's all sorts of stuff for people to check out. I guess new stuff at Medievalist.net and more stuff coming out every day. So thanks, Peter, for stopping by and telling us what's on the website.
Thanks.
Thank you to everyone who supports my work and that of other indie historians through Medievalist.net's Patreon page. Patrons have access to all sorts of awesome stuff like subscriptions to Medieval World magazine, a book club, digital downloads, and ad-free versions of Medievalist.net and this podcast, and more is being added all the time. To get in on all the action and support your favorite medievalists, please visit patreon.com/medievalists. For everything from Focus to Hocus Pocus, follow Medievalist.net on Facebook or X at Medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Cybulskie, across social media at 5MIN Medievalist or 5-Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores, where you can get hold of Chivalry and Courtesy, Medieval Manners for a Modern World, now out in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Geefrog. Thanks for listening, and have yourself a wonderful day.